The air over Providence Gulch on October 12, 1888, carried a peculiar and unsettling weight. It was a cold that did not just bite at the skin, but seemed to seep into the very marrow of the bones. A damp, penetrating chill that promised a winter of uncommon cruelty. The old-timers, men who had seen 50 such seasons come and go, spoke of it in hushed tones at Silas Croft's general store. They noted the early migration of the geese, the unusual thickness of the squirrels' coats, and the way the pine cones clung tightly to the branches, as if bracing for a siege. These were the ancient, unwritten almanacs of the high country, and they all foretold the same brutal truth. A long, deep, and unforgiving cold was descending upon them. For Elara Vance, the signs were even clearer. They were not in the sky or the trees, but in the memory of her grandfather's words. He had been a man of the old world, a stonemason from the high Alps who understood mountains and their fickle tempers. "Watch the ice," he used to say, his voice a low rumble like shifting rock. "When the first freeze comes before the ground is hard, the winter will have two mouths, one to bite with snow, the other to chew with ice." Elara had seen that very thing happen 2 weeks prior. A sudden, shallow freeze had crusted the mud in the streets, only to be followed by a week of rain that had turned the entire valley into a sodden mire. Now, the real cold was returning, and the ground was saturated. The winter would have two mouths. She was 18 years old. She had been a wife for a year and a widow for 6 months, her husband Thomas taken by a logging accident that had been as swift as it was senseless. Before that, she had been an orphan for a decade, her parents lost to the influenza that had scythed through the valley in '78. She lived alone in the small, sturdy cabin her husband had built at the edge of town, a home that was now hers to defend against the coming siege. Her assets were meager: the cabin itself, the 2 acres of stony land it sat upon, and the $47 in silver coins left in a tin box, a sum that had to last her until the spring thaw. Her most valuable inheritance, however, was not monetary. It was the trove of practical, often unconventional wisdom passed down from her grandfather. That evening, she attended the monthly town council meeting held in the drafty community hall. The assembly was presided over by the town's unassailable triumvirate of authority: Alderman Finch, a portly man whose wealth came from the lumber mill; Reverend Miller, whose sermons emphasized divine judgment and the folly of straying from established ways; and Silas Croft, the store owner, who held most of the town's debt in his ledger. They sat at a heavy oak table, the flickering light of kerosene lamps casting long, dancing shadows on the wall behind them. Elara waited patiently until the mundane business of road repairs and property lines was concluded. Then she stood. "Alderman Finch, gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the nervousness she felt. "I have a request. I intend to prepare for the coming winter. I believe it will be unusually harsh, and I need to ensure my firewood remains dry. To that end, I request the council's permission to excavate a cellar beneath my home for its storage." A low murmur rippled through the assembled men. Silas Croft leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "A cellar, Mrs. Vance? Your cabin has no foundation to speak of, just stone piers." "What you're proposing is to dig a hole and hope your house doesn't fall in it." "I understand the engineering, Mr. Croft," Elara replied, her tone even. "I will shore up the floor joists properly. The ground is stable. My grandfather was a mason. He taught me the principles of load-bearing structures." Reverend Miller steepled his fingers, his expression one of paternalistic concern. "My dear child, your caution is admirable, but perhaps misplaced. The Lord provides for his flock. We all lay in our wood. We stack it high, cover it with oilcloth, and trust in providence. It has been our way for generations. To engage in such a radical and frankly dangerous undertaking seems a testament to a lack of faith. "My faith is sound, Reverend," Alara said, meeting his gaze. "But my grandfather also taught me that God helps those who help themselves. The issue is not just snow. I believe a melt will come midwinter, followed by a hard freeze. A tarpaulin will not protect a woodpile from ground soak and a subsequent ice storm. The wood will be encased, rendered useless. A subterranean space, properly constructed, will keep the wood dry through any weather cycle by using the Earth's own insulation." This was too much for Alderman Finch. He slammed a fleshy palm on the table, not in anger, but with the weary finality of a man dealing with a persistent annoyance. "A midwinter melt? Child, you're speaking in riddles. We are facing a deep freeze, not a spring flood. What you propose is a waste of time and what little money you have. You will undermine your own home. The council cannot, in good conscience, sanction such a foolhardy enterprise. We are responsible for the safety of this town's inhabitants, even from their own fanciful notions. Request denied." The men nodded in agreement, their minds closed. They saw a young, grieving widow, her mind perhaps unbalanced by loss, clinging to the strange ideas of a foreign grandfather. They saw a girl, not a competent adult. They saw a problem to be managed, not appear to be heard. Alara stood for a moment longer, the silence in the hall pressing in on her. She had expected their refusal. She had, in fact, counted on it to solidify her resolve. "The town charter," she stated, her voice cutting through the smug silence, "grants the council authority over new constructions and public land. It says nothing about modifications made to the earth beneath a privately owned dwelling. I was not asking for permission. I was showing you the courtesy of informing you of my intentions." Without another word, she turned and walked out of the hall, the heavy door closing behind her with a definitive thud. She left behind a room of stunned and indignant men. Not one of them had lost a family member in the influenza of '78. Not one had burned through their wood supply nursing a sick spouse through a long winter. And not one, as they resumed their meeting with dismissive chuckles about her ice cellar, would admit, even to themselves, that the young woman's certainty had unsettled them. They mistook her confidence for arrogance, her knowledge for folly. It was a miscalculation that would cost them dearly. The next morning, on October 13th, 1888, Alara began her work. She rose before the sun, the air so cold it crystallized her breath in clouds of white. Her first task was not digging, but planning. She laid out the dimensions on the packed earth of the crawlspace beneath her cabin's floor. The space would be 12 feet wide and 16 feet long, centered directly under the main room. To begin, she had to remove several of the floorboards, creating an opening large enough to work through and haul out the excavated earth. She worked with a quiet, methodical precision, using a pry bar and hammer, carefully numbering each plank so it could be replaced perfectly. The digging was punishing, relentless labor. The tool of choice was a short-handled spade, ideal for the low clearance, and a heavy pickaxe for breaking up the compacted, rocky soil. For the first 2 days, she did nothing but break earth and haul it out in a sturdy wicker basket, one arduous load at a time. She dumped the soil around the exterior of the cabin's pier foundation, banking it against the low walls. This, her grandfather had taught her, was the first step in insulation. The earth itself would become a barrier, using its own thermal mass to shield the home from the worst of the wind and cold. The men who passed on the road to the lumber mill would stop and watch her for a few moments, their faces a mixture of pity and ridicule. They saw a woman engaged in a man's work, and a foolish one at that. "Digging her own grave," one of them muttered to another, loud enough for her to hear. She ignored them, her focus narrowed to the rhythm of the pickaxe, the scrape of the shovel, the ache in her shoulders and back. By the end of the first week, she had excavated to a depth of 4 feet. The progress was slow, hampered by a dense layer of clay and an abundance of stones, ranging from fist-sized rocks to boulders that required all her strength and leverage with the pry bar to unearth. These stones, however, were not a hindrance. They were a resource. She meticulously separated them, rolling the larger ones to one side of the growing pit and piling the smaller ones near the entrance. They would form the walls of her sanctuary. Each evening, she would collapse onto her mattress, her muscles screaming in protest, only to rise again in the pre-dawn chill and resume her task. Her hands, soft from a year of keeping house, were now blistered, raw, and calloused. But her resolve was harder than any stone she pulled from the earth. Alderman Finch made a point of stopping by on the 8th day of her labor. He stood at the edge of the crawlspace, peering down into the hole where Alara was working, her face smudged with dirt and sweat. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice oozing with false concern, "I implore you to cease this madness. Look at you! This is no work for a woman. You risk injury, not to mention the collapse of your home. If you are worried about firewood, come to the mill. I will extend you a line of credit for an extra cord of split oak. We can put it on your husband's account." Alara paused, leaning on her shovel. She looked up at the large, well-fed man silhouetted against the pale autumn sky. "My husband's account is closed, Mr. Finch, as is yours with me. I thank you for the offer, but I will see to my own provisions." She turned back to her work, the definitive scrape of her shovel against the rock-strewn dirt ending the conversation. Finch stood there for another minute, his face darkening with indignation, before turning on his heel and stomping away. His offer had not been one of kindness, but of control. He, like the others, was unnerved by her self-sufficiency. A dependent widow was an object of charity and a pillar of the established social order. An independent one was a threat to it. The excavation took a total of 3 weeks. When she was finished, the pit was a perfect rectangle, 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, and 10 feet deep. The sheer volume of earth she had moved, basket by basket, was staggering. The final stage of the digging involved creating a subtle gradient in the floor, sloping it towards one corner where she dug a small sump hole, about 2 feet deeper than the floor itself. From this sump, she dug a narrow drainage channel leading away from the house, a small but critical detail to prevent any ground moisture from pooling. This was the kind of foresight born from an understanding of the land, not from the rigid doctrines of men who built only on the surface. Now, the construction began. She started with the walls. Using the large stones she had painstakingly set aside, she began to build a dry stack wall, fitting the rocks together like a complex puzzle. This was the art her grandfather had perfected, a skill that required a patient eye and an intuitive understanding of weight, balance, and friction. She did not use mortar in the conventional sense. Instead, she filled the gaps between the stones with a thick, dense mixture she made herself. The heavy clay from the excavation, mixed with sawdust she'd gotten for free from Finch's mill, and a little water. When this mixture dried, it would be nearly as hard as cement, but with superior insulating properties. It took her another 2 weeks of patient, exacting work, hoisting stones into place, packing the clay mixture, ensuring every layer was stable and tight. The walls rose slowly, a testament to her endurance. The most critical and dangerous part of the project was shoring up the house itself. The town skeptics, led by Silas Croft, had confidently predicted that the moment she began tampering with the floor joists, the entire structure would sag and collapse. Croft, who fancied himself an amateur engineer, had told anyone who would listen that the girl was creating a death trap. Alara, however, had a plan her grandfather had sketched for her years ago. She had spent $19 of her precious silver coins on 4 massive 12 by 12-inch timbers from a logging camp upriver, avoiding Finch's Mill entirely. Working one section at a time, she built temporary supports. Then, with immense effort using a complex system of levers and fulcrums, she hoisted the massive timbers into place, setting them as the primary load-bearing beams spanning the width of the cellar. She seated them on the top of her new stone walls, creating a solid, unyielding foundation. She then used smaller timbers to cross-brace the original floor joists to these new, sturdier beams. It was an over-engineered solution, a belt and suspenders approach that was far stronger than the original pier foundation had ever been. When she was done, the floor above was more stable than any other in Providence Gulch. The house did not creak, sag, or shift by so much as a fraction of an inch. The final piece of the construction was the ceiling, which was also the floor of her main room. Here, she applied another of her grandfather's principles. She reinstalled the floorboards she had so carefully removed weeks before. But beneath them, she created a second, lower ceiling attached to the bottom of the joists, leaving a 6-inch gap between the two layers. She spent 3 days combing the woods and meadows, gathering dried moss, ferns, and straw. She packed this material tightly into the gap between the two ceilings. This created an insulated airlock, a thermal barrier that would prevent the cold from the cellar from seeping into her living space, and, just as importantly, prevent the heat from her cabin from melting any frost or ice that might form in the cellar. She also constructed 2 small ventilation shafts, one low on the north wall and one high on the south wall, each fitted with a simple wooden slide to open or close it. This would allow her to control the airflow, to let out any moisture-laden air, and to maintain a stable, frigid temperature throughout the winter. It was a simple but ingenious system based on the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. Cold air sinks, warm air rises. By November 20th, the winter keeper, as she called it, was complete. The total cost in materials had been $27, primarily for the heavy timbers, nails, and a few tools. The rest had been built with materials from her own land and her own unyielding labor. The final step was to cut an entrance, a small, insulated trapdoor in the floor of her cabin, and build a sturdy ladder leading down into the cold, dark space. Now, she had to fill it. She had already felled and bucked a significant number of dead standing pines on her property. For the next week, she did nothing but split and stack the wood. Her axe rose and fell in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. She did not create a single massive pile like her neighbors. Instead, she carried the split logs, armload by armload, down the ladder into her winter keeper. She stacked them meticulously, leaving channels for air to circulate between the rows, ensuring no piece was touching the damp stone walls. She filled the 16 by 12-foot space to a height of 7 feet, a massive reserve of dry, seasoned fuel. When she was finished, not a single stick of firewood was visible on her property. To any casual observer, it looked as though the widow Vance was completely unprepared for the coming winter. This observation only served to deepen the town's pity and scorn. Reverend Miller felt it was his Christian duty to make one last appeal. He arrived on a bitterly cold afternoon, the first snowflakes of the season just beginning to drift from a leaden sky. He found Alara sealing the edges of her cabin's foundation with a final layer of packed earth. "Alara, my child," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "The first snows are upon us. The time for projects is over. Your neighbors have noted you have no woodpile. This is no longer a matter of pride, but of survival. The church has a charity fund. Let us buy you a cord of wood. Allow the men to stack it for you. There is no shame in accepting help." Alara stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands. "Thank you for your concern, Reverend, but my preparations are complete. My wood is secure." The Reverend looked around the barren yard, his eyes full of sorrowful confusion. "Secure? Child, where? In that damp hole you have dug? It will be sodden with frost and ground leaching by Christmas. Wood must breathe. It must be kept in the open air. This is common knowledge." "There are different kinds of knowledge, Reverend," Alara replied quietly. "Common and uncommon. I am content with mine." She retreated into her cabin, leaving the man of God standing alone in the swirling snow, shaking his head at the tragic stubbornness of the young and foolish. He returned to town and told the others that the poor widow Vance was clearly in the grip of a deep delusion, and they must all pray for her. The snow began in earnest on December 18th, 1888. It did not come as a gentle flurry, but as a solid, blinding wall of white that descended from the mountains and swallowed the valley whole. The wind howled like a starving wolf, piling the snow into monstrous drifts that buried fences and rendered roads impassable. For 6 days and 6 nights, the storm raged without cease. It was the blizzard the old-timers had predicted, a storm for the ages. The people of Providence Gulch hunkered down in their homes, confident in their preparations. They had walls of stacked firewood, some rising as high as the eaves of their houses, all neatly covered with heavy, oiled canvas. They had ample provisions. They would simply wait it out. Inside her small cabin, Alara was warm and secure. Her modest fire in the cast-iron stove consumed little of her vast supply. The banked earth around her foundation deadened the shriek of the wind, and her small home felt as solid as a fortress. Once a day, she would lift the trapdoor, descend the ladder into the deep, still cold of the winter-keeper, and retrieve an armload of perfectly dry, resonant pine. The air in the cellar was frigid, but it was a dry, clean cold, entirely free of the dampness that permeated the world above. On the 7th day, Christmas Eve, the storm broke. The sun rose in a sky of impossible, crystalline blue, illuminating a world transformed. Providence Gulch was buried under an 8-foot blanket of pristine snow. The initial response was one of relief and communal cheer. Men began the arduous task of digging out, clearing paths between houses, their laughter echoing in the still, cold air. The worst, they all agreed, was over. They had weathered the great blizzard. The change came on the morning of December 26th. It started as a strange, warm breeze from the west, a phenomenon the plainsmen called a chinook, but one that was almost unheard of in these high, isolated valleys. Within hours, the breeze became a warm wind. The temperature, which had been holding at a steady 10 degrees Fahrenheit, began to climb with unnatural speed. By noon, it was 35 degrees. By mid-afternoon, it had reached a shocking 52 degrees. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The great melt began. Water dripped from every roof and tree branch, quickly becoming a torrential downpour. The 8 feet of snow, a vast reservoir of frozen water, began to release its contents. The sound of the valley was no longer the muffled silence of snow, but the constant roaring gurgle of water. The packed snow on the ground turned to a heavy, saturated slush. The neatly covered woodpiles of the townspeople were assaulted from all sides. The warm rain soaked them from above, penetrating the canvas covers. Worse, the melting snow created rivers of slush that flowed underneath the piles, soaking the bottom logs. The ground itself, already saturated from the autumn rains, could absorb no more. Every piece of firewood in Providence Gulch, save for the small stacks kept indoors, was being thoroughly, catastrophically drenched. Alderman Finch and the others were initially pleased. The warm spell was a welcome reprieve, a Christmas miracle, Reverend Miller called it from his pulpit. It made the work of clearing the roads easier. They were blissfully unaware of the silent disaster unfolding in their woodpiles. They believed that once the cold returned, the surface moisture would freeze and the wood beneath would remain sound. They did not understand the physics of saturation. Ilara knew. From her window, she watched the valley drown. She saw the dark, wet patches spreading through her neighbor's woodpiles. She opened the low vent on the north wall of her winter keeper just a crack, allowing the dense, cold air inside to slowly escape, and opened the high vent on the south wall, drawing the warmer, lighter air from outside down into the cellar. This subtle circulation would prevent condensation from forming on the cold wood as the outside temperature fluctuated, keeping her fuel bone dry. It was a delicate adjustment, another piece of her grandfather's subtle science. The unnatural warmth lasted for 2 days. On the evening of December 28th, the wind shifted again. It swung around to the north, and it brought the Arctic back with it. The temperature plummeted with a speed that was even more terrifying than its rise. From 52 degrees at sunset, it dropped to 20 by midnight, to 0 by 2 in the morning, and to a soul-crushing -25 degrees by dawn. The world froze solid. The slush in the streets became a sheet of corrugated, treacherous ice. The water that had soaked into every log, every piece of split wood in every wood pile in town, flash froze. The wood was no longer wood. It was wood and ice, solid blocks that were heavier and denser than stone. The winter, as Ilara's grandfather had foretold, had shown its second mouth. The blizzard had bitten them, but the ice would chew. The crisis did not announce itself immediately. Every home had a few days' worth of wood stored inside. It was only as these small, dry caches began to run out that the true horror of their situation became apparent. The first to realize it was Silas Croft. When he went to his woodpile to replenish his indoor stock, he found his axe bounced off the frozen logs with a dull thud, chipping off shards of ice, but making no impression on the wood itself. He tried to pry a piece free with an iron bar, but it was fused to its neighbors in an inseparable, frozen mass. He managed, after an hour of exhausting work, to break a few pieces loose. He carried them inside and placed them by his stove. They did not dry. They thawed, weeping water onto his hearth. When he tried to put them in the fire, they refused to ignite. They hissed and steamed, filling his store with a foul-smelling, acrid smoke and giving off almost no heat. The water, trapped deep within the wood's fibers, was absorbing all the thermal energy. His fuel was useless. A quiet panic began to spread through the town as, one by one, each family discovered the same awful truth. Their mountains of firewood, their symbols of security and preparedness, were worthless. They were surrounded by fuel, yet they were freezing. The cold was no longer just outside, it was inside their homes, relentless and lethal. The temperature in the cabins began to drop, matching the bitter cold of the outside world. Families huddled together under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air of their own living rooms. The first to perish was the elderly Martha Gable, her heart giving out in the frigid quiet of her small home on New Year's Day. Her death sent a shockwave of fear through the community. This was no longer an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Their pride, their adherence to tradition, their mockery of the woman with the strange ideas, all of it had turned to ash in their cold, smokeless stoves. It was on the evening of January 2nd, 1889, that a delegation of 3 men, their faces gaunt and etched with desperation, made their way across the frozen, moonlit snow to the small cabin at the edge of town. It was Alderman Finch, Reverend Miller, and Silas Croft. They were wrapped in every layer of clothing they possessed, yet they shivered uncontrollably. A thin curl of smoke rose from Alara Vance's chimney, a sight that was now the most precious and painful thing in the entire valley. It was a beacon of life in a dying town. They knocked on her door, their knuckles numb with cold. Alara opened it, a lantern held high. The warm, clean air that washed over them from inside her home was a stark, almost dizzying contrast to the brutal cold they had been breathing for days. They saw not a hint of smoke, smelled no acrid fumes, only the pleasant scent of burning pine and warm bread. For a long moment, no one spoke. The three most powerful men in Providence Gulch stood on the doorstep of the young widow they had scorned, their authority stripped away by the simple, absolute power of the cold. It was Alderman Finch who finally broke the silence, his voice raspy and broken. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his eyes unable to meet hers. We were wrong. We were fools." Reverend Miller, his face a mask of shame, added, "We were arrogant in our certainty. We mistook wisdom for foolishness. We ask for your forgiveness, and we ask for your help. The town is freezing. We have no dry wood. People will die." Alara looked at their faces, illuminated by her lantern. She saw no triumph in their humiliation, only a deep and profound sadness for the price of their lesson. She had not built her winter keeper for this moment, for vindication. She had built it for survival. But now, her survival and the town's had become intertwined. "Come in," she said simply, stepping back to let them inside. The warmth of the cabin enveloped them, and for the first time in days, the painful ache in their bones began to subside. She led them to the center of the room and lifted the heavy, insulated trap door. She handed the lantern to Silas Croft and gestured for him to look. The three men peered down into the darkness. The lantern light fell upon a sight that was, to them, more beautiful than any treasure. There, in the deep, dry cold of the cellar, were immaculate stacks of split pine and oak, each piece clean, dry, and resonant. It was a subterranean forest of fuel, a library of warmth, untouched by the flood and the freeze that had doomed the rest of the town. "How?" Silas Croft whispered, his voice filled with an awe that bordered on reverence. "The earth keeps its own counsel," Alara said, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "It holds a steady temperature. It is a better guardian against the whims of the sky than a canvas sheet." There were no further questions. There was only the quiet, desperate understanding of their salvation. Alara did not gloat or demand apologies beyond the one they had already offered. Her response was as practical and methodical as the construction of the cellar itself. She established a system of rationing. Each family would receive enough wood for one day's heat, distributed each morning. She would keep the ledger herself, ensuring the distribution was fair, with extra allotments for families with young children or the sick. The three men, once the leaders of the town, became her lieutenants, organizing the other able-bodied men to haul the wood on sleds to the desperate households. For the next 2 months, until the grip of the great freeze finally broke in early March, Ilara's winter keeper was the beating heart of Providence Gulch. Her small cabin became the center of the community, the source of life that radiated outwards. The men who had once mocked her now approached her with a quiet, profound respect. They saw the quiet competence, the unshakable resolve, and the deep well of wisdom they had so casually dismissed. They saw not a foolish girl, but a leader. When the spring thaw finally came, it revealed the true cost of their folly. The frozen wood piles rotted where they sat, a monument to their collective arrogance. The town had survived, but it was humbled. The old hierarchies had been shattered, replaced by a new order based not on wealth or tradition, but on proven wisdom and quiet strength. Alderman Finch, his business nearly ruined by the loss of his own lumber stores, publicly ceded his position on the council. Reverend Miller's sermons changed. He no longer spoke of blind faith, but of the wisdom in listening, in observing God's creation, and in respecting the knowledge of others, no matter how humble their station. Silas Croft tore up the debts of half the town, his near-death experience having taught him a lesson about the true nature of wealth. Ilara Vance never sought power or acclaim. She asked for nothing in return for saving them, but she received something far more valuable: the town's unwavering respect. They began to call her home not just the cabin, but the keeper's house. They came to her for advice, not just on preparing for winter, but on building, on planting, on the subtle arts of living in harmony with the harsh and beautiful land they called home. She had started the winter as an outcast, a grieving widow digging a hole in the dirt. She ended it as the sage of Providence Gulch, her vindication as silent, as deep, and as absolute as the life-saving cellar beneath her floor. The memory of the Great Freeze of '89 was etched into the town's history, a somber, enduring lesson that the most unconventional wisdom is often the only thing that stands between survival and oblivion.